Hello, everyone. This is Mr. Millette with an AP World History presentation. Today's presentation is about the interwar period, that is the 20-year period from 1919 to 1939 between World War I and World War II. In terms of the interwar period, students will be expected to be able to demonstrate their understanding of these two learning objectives. One, to be able to explain how different governments responded to economic crisis after 1900. Two, to be able to explain the continuities and changes in territorial holdings from 1900 to the present. The interwar period between 1919 and 1939 is often referred to as a 20 years crisis. Throughout Europe, new democratic nations were unstable, and tensions between and among political groups flared. Additionally, the onset of a worldwide economic crisis, dubbed the Great Depression, would challenge the practice of capitalism in the industrial nations. Its reach would severely impact many underdeveloped regions as well. In essence, this 20 years crisis captured the imperfections and failures of both democracy and capitalism in one of the most vulnerable periods of time in modern world history. This particular presentation is going to focus on three things. One, the debatable and varied causes of this global Great Depression. Two, responses to the global Great Depression, which will really emphasize alternatives to capitalism and democracy. And then third, nationalistic resistance to the continuation of imperialism after World War I. The next several slides will address the various debatable causes of the global Great Depression that will be experienced during the interwar period. More specifically, the next four slides will focus on the unraveling of capitalism. That is to say, the imperfections of the global capitalistic economy as it had been practiced to the point of the Great Depression. Americans, Europeans, and other citizens of industrialized nations experienced a new level of consumerism and the use of consumer credit. The Second Industrial Revolution that had predated World War I had brought an unprecedented level of material well-being. More specifically, in the United States, the 1920s was referred to as the Roaring Twenties, as fashion, music, radio, television, automobiles, and material possessions altered the lives of American citizens. The good life was experienced in a decade of post-war uncertainty and political instability. As the good life continued, its exposure of the imperfections of capitalism magnified. One thing that stands out about industrialization and the practice of free market economics is the conflation of the amount of material possessions one has with the quality of life one has. The motivation to do work for a wage so as to be able to ascertain material goods was a major characteristic of industrialized life. In earlier times in history, religious and ideological foundations actually warned followers of the dangers of accumulating wealth and material possessions. For example, in Buddhism and Jainism, material things were to be minimized so as to detach people from the desire of material possessions. Additionally, Christianity and Islam encourages followers to give charity so as to help the less fortunate. However, capitalism, a product of secularized Enlightenment idealism, did not seek to employ traditional teachings of moderation, acts of charity, and asceticism, but rather it sought to employ a work ethic, entrepreneurship, and financial profit. In essence, work, wage, and materialism was equated with human contentment. Humanity existed in a world with infinite wants, but finite resources. So whoever could obtain the greater portion of those finite resources was deemed ahead of others who were less fortunate. The proverbial rat race that is shown in the comic strip captures that cycle of work, wage, things, happiness. In spite of cultural, ideological, and religious influences that attempted to steer people away from their own materialistic wants, capitalism tended to win out by the outbreak of the Great Depression. The image below the comic strip shows a natural landscape adorned with billboards showcasing corporate advertisements. In the Second Industrial Revolution, mass production and mass consumption was complemented by mass marketing and mass distribution. Corporations took to mass marketing like billboards so as to push people to purchase material goods. But if the time comes when employment reduces, wages decrease, and demand declines to where people cannot afford material goods. Unfortunately, for a generation of people who had experienced enhanced consumer materialism, the desire for material goods would not diminish just because the ability to purchase consumer goods did diminish. This slide, which continues with the unraveling and imperfections of capitalism as one of the causes to the global Great Depression, focuses on capitalism's relative instability and unpredictability. Economic instability has been the historical experience throughout the modern age. This is especially so in the capitalistic economies of the industrialized nations, including the United States. Recessions, panics, temporary crises in some times, booms and bull markets in other times have made economic activity difficult to predict, prevent, and correct. Generally, capitalism could fix itself, as the natural forces of supply and demand would bring economic activity back to equilibrium. Take a look at the business cycle of the United States for the 70-year period of 1835 to 1905, shown in the timeline graph below. Notice the peaks and the troughs of the American business cycle. Equilibrium was not an economic mainstay throughout America's first century of industrialization and capitalism. About the only thing that one could really predict about capitalism is that it is unpredictable, and that peaks don't last and troughs will surely follow. But the trough won't last, and a peak will come back. But what if the trough lasts too long? What if the peak doesn't come fast enough? What if the natural forces of supply and demand do not correct the business cycle? This slide continues with the back end of America's historical business cycle, as the timeline graph below focuses on the 20th century. Take a look at the continued instability of the American business cycle from 1910 to 1985, indicated in the timeline graph below. What conclusions can you draw about the United States' historic business cycle? What tends to correlate with economic booms and peaks? What tends to correlate with economic decline and troughs? Can you explain these correlations? One thing I notice is that when America is at war, the business cycle is reaching peaks. However, when America is in peacetime, the business cycle slips into a trough. Interestingly, the years of the Cold War, to be studied in this class later this semester, from 1945 to 1991, there are fewer troughs in the business cycle, and noticeably more peaks. Consider why war, or the potential for war, as in the case of the Cold War, may create an economic situation where the business cycle is experiencing peaks. This slide, which also continues with the unraveling and imperfections of capitalism as one of the causes to the global Great Depression, focuses on capitalism's propensity to create socio-economic inequality within industrialized societies. Socioeconomic inequality is a cornerstone of capitalism. Recall, capitalism does not promise equality of the distribution of wealth, land, goods, or wages. That's what communism and socialism promise. In fact, capitalism embraces the opposite. It promises that wealth, land, goods, and wages will not be distributed evenly. It's a classic case of winners and losers. Recall, governments weren't supposed to be in the business of business. And aside from antitrust laws and a few political parties that had gained some momentum in affecting changes in unions, wages, hours, and conditions, socioeconomic inequality was not a problem that governments were expected to correct. However, when recession turned to depression, the imperfections of capitalism were magnified, including socioeconomic inequality. Check out the images below to get a visual understanding of socioeconomic inequality as it was magnified in times of economic despair. The bottom left photo shows a background image of a traditional American family of four, plus little Scruffy there hanging out the rear passenger window. The family is smiling and is clothed well and riding in a car, which implies they are living a fairly materialistic lifestyle and have benefited from the forces of capitalism. They are living the world's highest standard of living, the American way. In the foreground of the image is a line of unemployed and underemployed American citizens waiting in a financial aid relief line to receive emergency funds so as to be able to purchase the basic necessities of life, such as food, medicine, and clothing. The photographer imaged this contrasting foreground and background, which expose the greater magnification of the imperfections of capitalism. In this case, the socioeconomic inequality that was magnified when an economic crisis with high levels of unemployment set in on an industrialized society. The photograph captures, perhaps, the idealism of capitalism during a peak, but captures the harsh reality of capitalism during a depression. The bottom middle image is a famous photo taken by a photojournalist during the Great Depression in the United States. The photo is titled Migrant Mother, as this woman and her children were photographed and interviewed while they were moving about the western United States during the time of the agricultural failure of the so-called Dust Bowl of the Midwest. Hard times fell upon those with no property, no job, and no skill set outside of agriculture in the lesser developed regions of the United States. Migrant Mother and her children were products of this magnified socioeconomic inequality that the Great Depression featured. In the bottom right photo, Hooverville is depicted. Hooverville became the name of the homeless community that formed in Central Park in Manhattan after the Great Depression began. In the foreground, you can see the shanties that were built in Central Park, and the park is filled with New Yorkers, mostly males, adorned in business suits, worker uniforms, and professional attire. In spite of their appearances, the harsh reality was they were facing unemployment, homelessness, and financial insecurity. In the background is the bourgeois urban setting of Midtown Manhattan, where many brokers, investors, and professionals lived. The condos and high-rise apartments of Midtown Manhattan in the background, juxtaposed with the homeless community of Central Park in the foreground, exposes the magnified imperfection of capitalism's severe socioeconomic inequality. This slide addresses the difficulty that societies faced with transitioning from a wartime economy, like that of the time of World War I, to a peacetime economy. like that of the 1920s and 1930s of the interwar period. Consider, is it really likely that unemployment will be an issue when there's a war? Is it really possible to overproduce things like armaments, food, medicine, and clothing when total war is occurring in so much of the world? Well, during the Great War, it was nearly impossible to overproduce, especially in war material. Imagine a farmer or a business owner who produced at wartime levels and is now forced to produce at peacetime levels. They'd almost rather the war keep going. If they reduce production, factories close, fields lay barren, and unemployment rises. If they keep production levels in peacetime, then supply is too high. Prices plummet, and then factories close, fields lay barren, and unemployment rises. The difficulty for producers within industrialized societies was finding the balance between supply and demand. A business owner or a farmer that could not find that balance was doomed to financial failure. Take a look at the political cartoon to the right titled The Stumbling Block from 1930, the first year of the Great Depression. In the cartoon, the subject is a farmer who represents the farm industry, who is tripping over a bale of wheat that represents the overproduction of agricultural goods. The farmer is tripped and has lost the grip of a basket of eggs, which represents the price of American crops, like cotton and wheat, falling. In essence, when farmers overproduce crops, like wheat and cotton, there would be an abundance of supply that was not met with an equal demand. This forced wheat and cotton prices to decline. Those declined prices killed farmers' profits, abilities to pay wages, and ability to maintain farm equipment. Overproduction happened when farmers failed to transition from wartime production levels to peacetime production levels, and in effect, their profits suffered severely. To this point, we have focused on much of the American experience immediately before and during the Great Depression. But rest assured, the rest of the industrialized and even non-industrialized world was impacted by the Great Depression. Europe, for example, was not out of the reach of the global Great Depression. After the Great War, Europe was economically and physically devastated. Economically, England and France owed billions in war debts to their ally, the United States. Worse, the new Weimar Republic in Germany owed even more billions of dollars in punitive reparations to England and France. France and England needed German repayment. The United States needed French and English repayment. But all of this hinged upon Germany's ability or inability to pay their punitive reparations. The Treaty of Versailles forced Germany to disarm and minimize its industrial production and relinquish its overseas colonies. How was this young republic supposed to pay their $32 billion in reparations? Well, solution number one, print more money. Of course, it led to hyperinflation and the failure of the German market, and it still did not get England and France paid. When I was in kindergarten, I remember being in a department store with my mother. Of course, I dragged her down the toy aisle in that store and tried to cajole her to buy me a toy. I don't know, probably a Transformer, a He-Man figure, a G.I. Joe hero or vehicle, maybe a Lego set, or even a pack of Garbage Pail Kids stickers. Naturally, my mother told me that we did not have enough money to buy a toy that day, and that I have to be patient and wait until we did have enough money to buy it. In my 5-year-old kindergarten mind, I rationalized an immediate solution to our financial problem. Mom, if we don't have enough money right now, why can't we just create more money so that we can buy it? My mother's response was, son, that isn't how things work. Trust me, we'll return when we have the money. I left it at that, but in my head I knew my kindergarten solution would work. Take a look at the top right image. This is a photograph of a young German woman feeding German marks, the currency of the Weimar Republic, into a furnace in her home. Why not just use that fat stack of cash to pay her energy bill? Who on earth would ever literally use cash as kindling in their furnace? Well, the harsh reality of Germany's hyperinflation was that a stack of cash that large was so devalued that it could not pay the hyperinflated energy bill that she was assessed with in her home. Take a look at the bottom right image. This is a photograph of two German children using German marks in their arts and crafts. You got it. Construction paper was more expensive than the stack of cash the kids have on that table. In essence, German marks were so devalued that blank construction paper was valued higher than printed German paper money. German hyperinflation is inconceivable to people today. In 1923, the exchange rate of the German mark to the US dollar was about 4 trillion marks to 1 US dollar. You heard right, 4 trillion with a T. In simple terms, if a loaf of bread in Brooklyn, New York cost 1 US dollar, then that same loaf of bread sold in a market in Berlin, Germany would cost approximately 4 trillion German marks. How does one account for that sort of transaction? How high or low of a bill does one use to satisfy that transaction? How long does one wait for their change to be given back to them by a cashier when we're dealing with a simple transaction such as the purchase of bread that involves trillions of German marks? How did this hyperinflation set in for Germany in the early to mid 1920s? The kindergarten solution. When the Weimar Republic of Germany did not have the cash to pay their monthly installments of wartime reparations to the English and French governments, the government took to printing more German marks. And this completely devalued the German mark and put Germany's economy into ruin. Perhaps they could have used my mother's advice. Had the German government been patient and found another method to pay for something they could not afford at present time. Germany's failed attempt to solve its monetary problem would eventually spill into the other European economies. France and England needed Germany to be able to pay their war reparations, but Germany's initial solution to merely print more money was a dismal failure. Solution number 2, a more adult solution, if you will, or young adult solution, was to borrow money. If governments were willing to support lending firms to make international loans to governments that weren't quite of adolescent age, and pre-adolescent governments were willing to take those loans with interest rates, then what's the harm? All those good intentions, what could possibly go wrong? Well, the United States, as a global financial powerhouse, enacted the Dawes Plan, which is indicated to the right on this slide, to loan money to Germany so that Germany could pay its reparations to France and England, so that France and England could repay the United States the wartime debt that they had accrued from wartime loans. Remember, the United States didn't want to get entangled into European political conflicts, but it had no problem getting into their economic problems. Unfortunately for England and France, in spite of America's Dawes Plan, Germany could not keep up with its reparations payments. To make matters even more grim, over the next 10 years, the German government would transition into a government that would purposely not play by the preset guidelines of international economic cooperation. This slide pinpoints the exact point where the global financial ruin took place, the stock market crash in 1929. The New York Stock Exchange was the largest and most diverse stock exchange in the world. American and foreign companies were listed, as well as American and foreign investors spent their money on stocks. Up to October of 1929, the New York Stock Exchange had experienced a bull market. In hindsight, the bull market may have been a result of stock speculation, the purchase of stocks on the margin, and overconfidence in the strength of the stock market. Eventually, prices of stocks reached their pinnacle and had only one direction to go: down. It left investors who were looking to sell stocks to make a quick profit with nobody to buy. It left brokers with indebted clients. It left companies with no investors. And ultimately, it collapsed the financial market of the United States and all those that were tied to it internationally. In the image on the top right, you can see a crowd of Wall Street brokers surrounding the deceased body of one of their own. Evidently, there were 2 stock market crash suicides on Wall Street in the days following Black Thursday in 1929. In the image to the bottom right is a photo of the mass panic bank withdrawals that Americans made in the face of the ensuing financial crisis. This panic happened between 1930 and 1931 and was still problematic by early 1933. Too many banks were not members of the Federal Reserve, and therefore, when Americans panicked and withdrew their money in mass, the non-member banks emptied their vaults of reserve cash in order to meet panicking Americans' demands. It was a clear sign that America's financial system was in complete disarray. This slide focuses on how some nations' governments' immediate reactions actually worsened the Great Depression and caused it to become a more globalized experience. Prior to the Great Depression, economic panics and crises were typically a single nation's problem. That problem did not typically extend to more nations across the globe. However, as nations' governments, lending firms, and corporations became more interdependent in a globalizing economy, the Great Depression became a global problem. In the past, a nation's government could practice autarky or protectionism. In essence, they would raise tariffs in order to protect domestic businesses and workers by driving the price of imports up so that citizens would buy domestic products. However, when governments applied this traditional method to solving a national economic crisis to a global economic crisis, the amount of global trade plummeted, and as a result, nations whose economies were dependent on imports and exports were crippled. One such attempt was the Hawley-Smoot tariff, begrudgingly enacted by President Herbert Hoover. In the newspaper clipping in the top right of the slide, you can see that economists, especially classical economists, asked Hoover to veto the bill as they believed the tariff would have negative effects on global trade. In consequence, the image in the bottom right of the slideshow shows the downward trend of global trade measured in billions of US dollars. This is the final slide that addresses the various potential causes for the global Great Depression. To this point, we've focused on how industrialized nations and their economies were negatively impacted. Few national economies remained out of the reach of globalizing Great Depression. And in fact, even agricultural and industrially underdeveloped economies were also hard hit by the globalizing Great Depression. This slide focuses on how one of these regions of the underdeveloped world, Latin America, was severely impacted by the global Great Depression. Non-industrialized economies of Latin America and the European colonies of Africa and Asia were not left out of the Great Depression. In fact, these economies were dependent on the industrialized nations' purchases of primary exports. Primary products such as beef, coffee, cocoa, and resources such as copper and rubber were exported from Latin America and European colonies of Africa and South and Southeast Asia. As industrialized nations of North America and Europe no longer demanded these primary products because they could no longer afford them, the national economies of these underdeveloped nations and colonies also failed. Take a look at the resource map on the right side of the slide. The map indicates the different crops and resources in which Latin American economies were dependent. Many of these crops and resources are primary products, meaning they are in a raw and unprocessed state when they are harvested or extracted. Take, for example, cotton or sugar. Both of these are primary products prior to them being refined or processed into a finished good or product. Consider anything that is grown out of the ground, mined out of the ground, or grazed on the ground as a pool of primary products. Probably the best example of a Latin American nation whose economy suffered severely from the steep decline of trade and sales of primary products with industrialized nations was Argentina. Argentina was one of the world's leading suppliers of beef. In fact, its number one buyer of Argentine beef was England, one of the most industrialized nations in the world. When the Great Depression struck England and their ability to purchase or trade for resources coming from places outside of their empire diminished. Argentina's largest beef market was no longer there for Argentine prosperity. This sent Argentine cattle ranches into dismal economic failure. This is the first slide that addresses the various ways in which governments responded to the continued crisis of the Great Depression. Recall, for many industrialized nations who practiced capitalism, governmental intervention in the nation's economy was not something that was a part of that capitalistic practice. The mere suggestion of governmental intervention into the natural forces of supply and demand became a highly politicized debate. In other nations whose governments had a greater role in their national economies, perhaps intervention was not that great of a transition. However, governmental intervention looked quite different throughout the world. This first slide addresses how the United States' government responded to the Great Depression. In 1930, the United States was dealing with a high unemployment rate and residual effects such as high divorce rates, father abandonment of families, and suicide. As factories closed and demand for labor declined, unemployment and underdeployment became a real problem. Initially, the United States' government looked to put people to work through state-sponsored construction projects, like the building of the Hoover Dam. Eventually, under President Franklin Roosevelt, Keynesian economics would be applied, as the government sought to increase its role in stimulating economic growth through more government-sponsored work programs, subsidy programs, and Social Security. This became known as the New Deal in the United States. In the political cartoon to the right, you can see the central figure is President Franklin Roosevelt, and he is surrounded by children with different abbreviated letters on their backs. The WPA was the Works Progress Administration, and as part of Roosevelt's New Deal, he utilized this program in order to hire unemployed people as laborers in building public works and public buildings. It actually employed more than 8 million workers in its 8-year span. Additionally, the PWA, or the Public Works Administration, was created in order to employ people in the construction of large public works, such as dikes, dams, irrigation systems, bridges, hospitals, and schools. You can also see one titled AAA, which stood for the Agricultural Adjustment Administration. This program was passed in tandem with the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which sought to subsidize farmers who had overproduced products. In essence, farmers were paid by the federal government to not work or produce so as to combat overproduction and falling prices. One of the major New Deal programs that Roosevelt enacted was the Social Security Act, which provided a safety net for people who were too old or no longer physically capable of working and earning a wage. It also helped to shift the workforce into a more youthful one by providing a financial benefit to the elderly who could now leave the workforce and opening up jobs for young people who were unemployed or underemployed during the years of the Great Depression. The New Deal was possible through increased taxes and deficit spending, both aspects of Keynesian economics. This slide addresses how some of the European governments responded to the Great Depression. More so than in the United States, socialist and labor-friendly political parties had a long-standing influence on European governments. That means European governments were more used to enacting policies that protected workers' rights, wages, and conditions. Political division among labor or socialist, liberal, and conservative political parties provided no real solutions to the Great Depression in any European nation. In England, problems with worker unrest, unemployment, and decline in overseas investments were combated with attempts to balance governmental fiscal budgets and protective tariffs. In France, socialist leaders attempted some work programs and improved worker conditions in what was dubbed the French New Deal. In the image to the right, you can see French Prime Minister Léon Blum, a socialist, who extended protections for workers during a time where he felt their labor could have been exploited in the depths of the Great Depression. However, neither nation fully recovered economically by the outbreak of World War II. In Scandinavian nations, social democratic governments established welfare states that relied on high taxes, increased governmental investment in work and social programs, as well as domestic enterprise. The welfare states that began during the Great Depression would ultimately become the practice of Europe in the years after World War II. However, the Scandinavian states were really the first to establish such states. Today, the critics of the welfare state refer to them as nanny states and draw on their maternal tendencies to take care of society from the cradle to the grave. Today, Europe's welfare states are characterized by high taxes, but provisions of health care, college tuition, long-term unemployment payments, and liberal paid maternity leave are made to Europe's citizens. Italy and Germany arguably had the most extreme responses to the Great Depression, as they sought to increase governmental control over labor and production, yet retain corporations and corporate profits. In this political and economic transition, Italian and German political leaders turned to totalitarianism, which ultimately stripped the rights of citizens, including workers, in order to bolster the authority of their governments. As political instability coupled with economic decline, some political groups sought extreme changes in government and the government's role in the national economy. For example, fascism became a popular political movement that prioritized the nation, its economy, its military, and its people's racial superiority. Benito Mussolini seized power in Italy and instilled a fascist regime that stripped workers' rights to strike in order for industrialists to amp up production at low costs. Adolf Hitler would instill a Nazi regime that did likewise and breached international law per the Treaty of Versailles by reopening armaments factories in order to put Germans back to work. To the right, you can see the images of both Mussolini and Hitler, the totalitarian leaders of Italy and Germany, respectively. Mussolini's rise to power came through revolution in the early 1920s, where he and his black shirts, or fascists, forcibly seized power in Rome from King Victor Emmanuel III. In this undemocratic event, Mussolini continued to combat any democratic progress Italy had achieved since its unification in 1870. And with that, he became one of the most powerful political figures in the world. His success in Italy impressed Adolf Hitler in Germany, who in the middle of the 1920s recognized that the Weimar Republic was in no condition to help Germany's financial problems. Hitler believed Germany had been punished too harshly and believed the Weimar Republic was too weak to stand up for itself against the French and English governments that preyed on Germany's demise. In a similar fashion as Mussolini, Hitler attempted a revolt against the Weimar Republic, but it was put down, and Hitler and many of his brown shirts, or Nazis, were imprisoned. During his prison time, Hitler authored Mein Kampf and outlined his plan to bring Germany back to pre-depression status. Upon his release from prison, he reorganized and re-identified his Nazi party, and by the early 1930s, Nazis were gaining an abundance of seats in the Weimar Republic's Reichstag. In fact, in 1933, Hitler was appointed chancellor, and in that same year, the Republic enacted the Enabling Acts, which gave Hitler dictatorial powers to pass laws without the Republic's support and consent. In essence, fascism and Nazism, as forms of totalitarianism, took extreme action in a political and economic sense in their responses to the economic disaster of the interwar period. As mentioned earlier, few nations' economies were outside of the scope of the global Great Depression. One such example was the Soviet Union. Merely a decade old during the Depression, the Soviet Union served as a model for communism as a viable alternative to capitalism. The fact that a nation could still industrialize, produce, and increase its gross domestic product through a planned and highly regulated economic system exposed the fact that capitalism was not the only method of achieving industrial development. Politically, the Soviet Union also turned toward totalitarianism, as Soviet leadership took total control over the means of production, the press, and many aspects of everyday life. Joseph Stalin implemented a command economy in the enactment of his first 5 years plan. This plan sought to rapidly industrialize and militarize Russia to an unprecedented level. Soviet Russia was the only industrialized nation whose GDP continuously increased during the worst years of the Great Depression. In spite of an authoritarian regime that led to purges, forced labor, and failed food distribution policies, the Soviet model of communism became appealing in many nations worldwide. In the liberal democracies of Western Europe and North America, communist parties gained popularity. Outside of the West, communism gained popularity, especially in China, in the interwar period. Stalin's economic policies within his 5 years plan was a drastic turn away from his predecessor, Vladimir Lenin's economic policy. Lenin had actually utilized free market, capitalistic practices that allowed for private land ownership, unrestricted wages, and corporate private enterprise. Stalin's 5 years plan eradicated Lenin's policies and completely instituted a command economy in which production and consumption were completely regulated by the Soviet government. Russia's model would be utilized later in the century in places like Cuba, Vietnam, and North Korea as a viable alternative to capitalism and capitalism's imperfections. This slide addresses the response that Japan's government gave to the global Great Depression, as it, like Germany, Italy, and the Soviet Union, turned toward greater authoritarianism, militarism, and aggression. In Japan, militant authoritarianism and anti-Western sentiments emerged as the Great Depression was seen as a Western cause. Japan's government shifted away from a constitutional monarch with a representative assembly to one with military control. Economically, Japan shifted toward heavy industry and armaments. As Japan's economic relations dwindled with Western nations, the militant government sought to conquer East Asian territories and exploit resources, land, and labor to improve the Japanese domestic economy. As a member of the League of Nations, many Japanese actions were left unpunished by the other League members. Japan's continued desire to expand its empire in the Far East and the Pacific worsened its relationship with European nations and the United States. Its aggression against China and other Far Eastern states showcased Japan's willingness to take what economic resources it deemed necessary for its nation's survival. This slide shows the increased militant aggression that Japan took against its Far East neighbor, China. This aggression took a toll on China's already enfeebled nationalist government. The fact that a lot of Japan's acts of aggression were unchecked gave Japan a bit of a red carpet to take over vital regions of the Far East in the early 1930s. Even prior to World War I, Japan was an imperialistic aggressor in the Far East, seizing control of Korea and Formosa, today referred to as Taiwan, after the First Sino-Japanese War. Additionally, the southern portion of the Kamchatka Peninsula, located in southeastern Russia, came under Japanese control after the Russo-Japanese War. The Japanese continued with their imperialism when the Great Depression set in, as they invaded Manchuria and set up the Japanese state of Manchukuo in 1931. That year, the Japanese military designed a plan that involved them using dynamite to destroy one of their own Japanese-owned rail lines in Manchuria. They staged this incident so as to justify to the international scene Japan's increased military presence in China. This became known as the Mukden incident, and it was later discovered that the Japanese had in fact staged this all along. To spite the Chinese, the Japanese government instated a new leader to be in charge of Manchukuo. They chose to put the former boy emperor of the Qing dynasty, Puyi, in charge of Manchukuo. Puyi was just 6 years old when the Chinese Nationalist Revolution took place in 1911, and so his adult reign never happened, as the Qing dynasty was overthrown. Now an adult in the 1930s, the Japanese put Puyi in control of Manchukuo just to show up the Chinese nationalist government at the time. In response, the Japanese government left the League of Nations in 1933 to continue to pursue its own militant path in the Far East. That path took the Japanese military into Beijing, where the first battle of the Second Sino-Japanese War began, in what was called the Marco Polo Bridge incident near Beijing in 1937. Some historians claim that this battle is the actual first battle of World War II, as both Japan and China would become entangled into the alliances of the Second World War within just a few years. This slide shows the way in which some of the Latin American governments responded to the global Great Depression. As most Latin American leaders sought to bring their most crucial industries under national control, rid their nations of foreign investors, and their tradition of economic dependence on the more industrialized world. Nations like Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico were impacted negatively by the Great Depression. These nations' economies were dependent on exporting primary products to industrialized nations. When the industrialized nations stopped trading with these Latin American nations, the governments of these Latin American nations sought to instill fascist-like regimes that nationalized specific resources. Additionally, they employed import substitution industrialization policies in order to reduce their dependence on industrialized nations. Argentina's leader Juan Perón, pictured in the bottom left of this slide, nationalized fossil fuels like coal and petroleum, airlines, banking systems, and infrastructural work to wean from Argentina's economic dependency. Mexico's leader, Lázaro Cárdenas, pictured in the bottom middle of this slide, also took to nationalization of vital industries in order to protect Mexico's domestic economy. He would also oversee Mexico's increased industrial capacity and urban electrification in the late 1930s. Brazil's leader, Getúlio Vargas, pictured in the bottom right of this slide, took similar measures in nationalizing Brazil's most vital resources and industries, including petroleum. In many ways, these Latin American leaders instilled nationalistic spirit in their citizens, and in return, they wielded tremendous political and military authority. One of the major issues that continued to aggravate international tensions, in addition to the global Great Depression, the turn away from democracy, and the movement toward totalitarianism, was the continuation of imperialism in Asia and Africa. With the conclusion of World War I and the transfer of Germany's former colonies to England, France, and Japan, continued imperialism generated even greater intensified nationalistic reaction from subject colonial peoples. Additionally, the cost of empire during the Great Depression forced nations like France and England to reduce its military budgets, which lessened their ability to maintain order in their Asian and African colonies. Also, the fact that England and France's Asian and African colonies were severely negatively impacted by the global Great Depression gave colonial societies the justification to intensify their nationalistic movements and vie for political independence and self-determination. This first slide deals with this situation in India, which had been an English royal colony since the end of the Sepoy Revolt and the dismissal of the Mughal Empire in 1857. Tensions mounted between the Indian National Congress, which was an Indian representative body that prioritized Indian independence, and the English government in the days following World War I. Recall, Indian colonial soldiers fought valiantly for the British Empire, and they were a big reason for England's success against the Ottoman Empire during World War I. England's dismissive attitude toward the Indian National Congress's support of their war effort and the Congress's demands for independence came to a head in 1919 during the Amritsar massacre in Amritsar, India. The English government had recently passed a law that made it unlawful for Indian peoples to congregate in public spaces in large groups. Many of the members of the Indian National Congress saw this as an act to inhibit their ability to vie for their own independence. And Amritsar English and sepoy soldiers shot into a crowd of Indian subjects who were gathered in the marketplace. The Indian National Congress utilized this event as justification for the intensification of their nationalistic endeavors. During the 1920s, the leadership of the Indian National Congress changed considerably as Mahatma Gandhi became the head of the Congress. He pushed for nonviolent acts of resistance in order to secure Indian independence. Gandhi's passive resistance was utilized in his famous Salt March in 1930, where he and other marchers, as well as members of the Indian National Congress, purposely breached English laws regarding salt collection in the Indian Ocean. The beatings and violent arrests that Gandhi and the other marchers endured enabled his movement to gain more national and international support for India's independence. This slide deals with the intensified nationalistic movement of Pan-African nationalism. Recall, Africa's coastal areas fell under European colonization starting in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. Africa's interior came under European colonization in the late 19th century following the Berlin Conference during the Age of Imperialism. Colonial African societies had attempted movements of resistance against European colonization, and much like India's subject peoples, many African colonial subjects had contributed to England and France's military causes during World War I. They did this in hopes that the English and the French would grant them the independence they were promising during the war. Those promises were revisited with the rhetoric of self-determination at the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. However, when the peace treaties were finalized, African colonial societies remained just that, subjected peoples to Europe's continued imperialism. Pan-Africanism gained popularity during the interwar period against English, French, and other European colonial systems. Pan-Africanism was a movement that sought to unify all peoples of Africa and African descent into a single independent African Union. That African Union would be free from the oppressive systems of European imperialism. One of the foremost leaders of the Pan-African movement was Jamaican-born Pan-Africanist Marcus Garvey. Garvey promoted Pan-Africanism to include peoples of African descent living in the Americas, in hopes to make the goal of a Pan-African unity a reality. This slide deals with the intensified nationalistic movement of Pan-Arab nationalism. Similar to Pan-Africanism, Pan-Arabism grew out of Arab disdain for European control in the Middle East and North Africa. Much like African and Indian colonial soldiers had fought valiantly for European nations, Arab populations aligned with England in order to defeat the Ottoman Turkish Empire during the war. And echoing similar promises of self-determination to Arab peoples, as had been done in India and Africa, when the war concluded and those promises were not kept, Arab nationalists intensified their cause. In fact, with the final treaties of World War I establishing English and French mandates in the Middle East after the Ottoman Empire's dissolution, aggravated Arab nationalism into greater intensification. Constantine Zurich, a Syrian-born Arab nationalist, was among the leadership of the Pan-Arab movement. He believed, much like Garvey in respect to Pan-Africanism, that for Arabs to both secure their independence and exist as a prominent group in the world, that all Arabs must come together into a single Arab Union. This slide deals with a movement known as Zionism. Zionism was a movement for Jewish nationalism. Started in the 19th century, Zionism became a solution to the rampant anti-Semitism that Jews experienced throughout the world. Jews were subject to discrimination and prejudice in European nations and the United States throughout the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century. Zionists believed that to end institutional anti-Semitism, that all Jews would have to come together in a single Jewish union. Zionists rejected the notion of Jews assimilating into European and American cultures because they believed that that would continue to diminish the existence of their culture and their national identity. In 1917, England's Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs and future Prime Minister Arthur Balfour issued the Balfour Declaration. This declaration spelled out the English government's support to utilize the land of Palestine, today the nation of Israel, as a homeland for Jews. In essence, Jews scattered throughout European nations could uproot and move to Palestine, and in the near future establish itself as an independent nation. When Balfour became Prime Minister of England in the early 1920s, he oversaw a large wave of Jews settling into the region. This increased tensions among Arabs and Jews, and Arabs and the English, as the Arab nationalists saw Jewish settlement into Palestine as a threat to their nationalistic aspirations and desirable territories. This slide addresses the continued development of China's nationalistic government. Recall in 1911, the Qing dynasty was ousted from power, and China's nationalist government was established. During World War I, China fought on the side of the Allied powers. But when the war concluded, the Allied powers allowed the Japanese to dictate more of their takeover of Chinese territory and economic resources, with the development of Japan's 21 demands over China's nationalist government. Chiang Kai-shek became the leader of China's nationalist government in 1928. He had a daunting task in that he had to deal with a growing Chinese Communist Party. In fact, by the middle of the 1930s, China was pretty much divided between a north that was predominantly supportive of Mao Zedong's Communist Party and a south that was predominantly supportive of Chiang Kai-shek's Nationalist Party. Chiang Kai-shek's task became even more difficult as the Japanese military continued to make its way into Chinese territories. Between his mortal domestic enemy, Mao and the Communists, and his mortal foreign enemy, Japan and its imperialism, Chiang Kai-shek led a China that was still vulnerable to internal and external pressures. Ultimately, by 1937, Chiang Kai-shek was able to put China's civil war between his nationalists and Mao's communists on hold, so as to concentrate his energy, efforts, and manpower against the invading Japanese. Much to the chagrin of Chiang Kai-shek's desire to keep China independent and stable, after Japan's defeat at the end of World War II, Mao's Communist Party forced the Chinese Civil War to reconvene. Here you can see the differences between these two Chinese leaders and gain a greater understanding as to why they were so antagonistic toward each other. Economically, as crisis beset countries after World War I and undermined the faith in capitalism and market-based economics, politically unresolved disputes over the control of land continued to fester. The victors in the war, European powers and Japan, generally kept or expanded control over colonial territories. However, anti-imperial resistance was growing throughout Asia and Africa. In larger context, the spread of nationalism in these regions was part of the same global trend that included the breakup of European empires, the rise of totalitarianism in Europe, and the success of communism in Russia. In essence, the institutions of imperialism, democracy, and capitalism were severely challenged in the interwar period. These challenges made it difficult for nations to cooperate in a political and economic sense, and unfortunately for humanity, A return to a destructive total war would be inevitable.